full crystallized soul, and it survives that second death. When you create a crystal, the atoms of that substance come together into what they call a crystal lattice, which is a structure that takes on the lowest level of energy requirements to maintain. Similar to how you have in nature, for example, a honeycomb. It's in a hexagonal grid because it's got the most efficient way of coming together in order to maximize space, structural integrity, and so forth. It's the same sort of thing when a crystal forms. Now, if you take a crystal compared to the chaotic atomic structure that's not crystallized, when you form a crystal, it is a lot more interesting. Let's say different powers arise from reforming into that crystal lattice compared to just having the atoms in a more chaotic form. And you see things exhibited like the piezoelectric effect that you see in different crystals, including quartz, for example, where if you bend it or deform it, they say in scientific terms, if you bend it or squeeze it, then it will generate an electrical charge. Putting pressure on it will generate electricity. You don't get that kind of thing from the atomic structure that's not in a crystal lattice of that substance. Another thing that you see in crystals is a prismatic effect. So it will bend and disperse light in different ways than the non-crystallized form, where it can separate out the different bands of light, for example, as in like a prism. It can reflect light in really interesting ways that you don't see in the same atomic substance that's in a chaotic form compared to in a crystal form. So I like that term, the crystal body, or as the diamond body, because it's like taking the carbon atoms that are the major ingredient, you could say, or the major component of our physical body. And if you could get that crystallized into a diamond form, for one thing, that is one of the hardest substances on the planet that we're aware of, diamond. And it refers to the idea that it's a lot more structurally, has a lot more structural integrity, and it's harder to kind of break apart than you can't just crumble it in your fingers, for example. Whereas you could have a pile of carbon in the form of, coal, and you could just crumble it in your fingers. Whereas if you have it in the crystal lattice form of a diamond, it's extremely hard. You can't just break it apart. And this ties into the afterlife as well. If we want to take it that far, which we might as well. Let's get into it. So the idea here is that if we take that same macrocosm, microcosm, or as above, so below, that Hermetic axiom, we look to see, okay, on the physical plane, what happens when we die, when our body stops functioning. One of the first things that happens is that the bonds between the different components of the physical body start to break apart, and then all the different components eventually go their own way and go on to make other physical bodies. And some parts break down more than other parts before getting reused. So similarly, on the non-physical plane, you could say on the level of the soul, the individual soul, the bonds between the different soul fragments, that most people, in most cases, their soul or their psyche is a loose conglomeration of fragments. And so after death, the bonds between those soul fragments start to loosen and break apart, and eventually those soul fragments go off and end up getting reused in other souls. The one difference here is that being non-physical, it's not limited. Each individual soul fragment can get recopied multiple times instead of just like a part of the body getting reused multiple times at the same simultaneously. That can't happen physically, but it can happen on the non-physical level because that limitation doesn't exist on that level of existence. But ultimately, the soul breaks down into fragments and goes off to get reused for other souls. And some people refer to this as the second death. Now, if you have during life achieved a certain level of internal harmony, internal integration of those different fragments. If you've taken the soul fragments that you have, which you inherited or picked up along the way, and it's an ongoing process, it's something that's just always going on. But if you've taken those soul fragments and you have refined and healed them and integrated them all into a complete harmonized self, which is ultimately it's the quintessence of the self. This is what we refer to as the diamond body. Then essentially no bonds between soul fragments because you've created this complete harmonized self. There are no fragments. It's a complete crystallized lattice of soul fragments, of soul stuff, really. It's not fragments anymore. It's a crystal, a full crystallized soul, and it survives that second death.